The thorns from my bouquet were drawing blood, but I couldn't feel the pain anymore. Nothing could compare to the agony ripping through my chest as I stood there in that empty church, my white dress suddenly feeling like a costume for the world's cruelest joke. 3 hours. 3 fucking hours I had waited at those oak doors like some pathetic fool, watching every single guest file in with their sympathetic smiles and whispered conversations. Maybe he's just running late, his sister had said 2 hours ago, her voice dripping with fake concern. But I could see it in her eyes. She knew. They all knew. James wasn't coming. The realization hit me like a physical blow when his best man, David, finally approached me with that look of manufactured sympathy plastered across his face. His expensive suit suddenly seemed to mock my carefully chosen dress, the one I'd saved for 3 months to buy, the one I thought would be perfect for the most important day of my life. "Emily," he started, and I already knew what was coming. "James, he wanted me to tell you." "Tell me what?" My voice came out stronger than I felt, but inside I was crumbling like ancient paper. The church doors behind me felt like they were closing in, trapping me in this nightmare. David's eyes darted around, anywhere but at me. He's having second thoughts. He says he's not ready for marriage, that he needs time to figure things out. Time to figure things out. After 5 years together. After planning this wedding for 8 months. After I'd turned down Harvard Law School because he begged me to stay, because he said we'd build a life together right here. The guests were starting to stare more openly now, their hushed conversations growing louder. I could hear fragments. "Poor girl. I knew this would happen. She's too good for him anyway." But the pity in their voices made everything worse. I didn't want their sympathy. I wanted my fiancé. I wanted the life we'd planned. "Where is he?" I demanded, my grip tightening on the bouquet until I felt more thorns pierce my skin. The physical pain was almost welcome. At least it was real, tangible, something I could control. "Emily, please don't make this harder than it already is," David said, and I wanted to slap that patronizing tone right out of his mouth. He left this morning. He's gone to stay with his cousin in Chicago for a while." Gone. He was gone. He hadn't even had the decency to face me himself, to look me in the eye and destroy my world with his own words. He'd sent his best man like some coward, leaving me to pick up the pieces of my shattered dreams in front of everyone we knew. I felt my legs start to shake, the full weight of humiliation crashing down on me. My mother was crying somewhere behind me. I could hear her soft sobs mixing with the uncomfortable shuffling of 200 wedding guests who didn't know whether to leave or stay. The photographer was still snapping pictures, probably thinking this was some artistic, dramatic moment, instead of the complete destruction of my life. "The reception is paid for," I heard someone whisper. "What do we do about the reception? What do we do about the reception? What about what we do about my heart? What about what we do about the fact that I'd given up everything for a man who couldn't even be bothered to show up to our wedding?" James's mother, Patricia, finally approached me. I'd always tried so hard to win her approval, bending over backwards to be the perfect daughter-in-law. She'd never warmed to me, always made me feel like I wasn't quite good enough for her precious son. Now she looked at me with something that might have been guilt, but it was too little, too late. "Emily, dear," she said in that tone she used when she was trying to sound caring, but really just wanted to manage the situation. "Perhaps it's best if you go home now. Let people process this. Go home." To the apartment James and I shared, filled with wedding gifts and plans for a honeymoon we'd never take. To the life I'd built entirely around a man who had just proven he didn't want me. But something inside me snapped. Maybe it was the way she said it, like I was the problem that needed to be removed. Maybe it was the way everyone was looking at me like I was a wounded animal that might bite. Maybe it was the crushing realization that I'd wasted 5 years of my life on someone who could abandon me without even a conversation. "No," I said, my voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd. "No, I'm not going anywhere. Do you know what I gave up for him? Do you know what I sacrificed?" Patricia's face went pale. "Emily, please don't cause a scene." "A scene?" I laughed, and it sounded hollow even to my own ears. Your son left me at the altar, and you're worried about me causing a scene." The church had gone completely silent now. Even the children had stopped fidgeting. Everyone was watching, waiting to see what the abandoned bride would do next. "I turned down Harvard Law School for him," I continued, my voice getting stronger with each word. "I gave up my dreams, my future, because he said he loved me, because he said we'd build something together. And this is how he repays that sacrifice? By running away like a coward?" I could see some of the guests nodding, finally understanding the full scope of James's betrayal, but their sympathy felt hollow now. What good were their nods and understanding when my life was in ruins? "He'll regret this," Patricia said quietly, and for the first time she sounded sincere. "Emily, he'll regret this for the rest of his life, but regret wouldn't give me back the years I'd lost. Regret wouldn't undo the humiliation of standing in a wedding dress with no groom. Regret wouldn't restore the dreams I'd abandoned for a love that had apparently never been real." I dropped the bouquet then, let those blood-stained flowers fall to the church steps like a funeral arrangement. The white roses scattered across the stone, and I watched them with a strange detachment, as if I was observing someone else's tragedy. "Tell James," I said, my voice steady now, calm in a way that surprised even me, "that he's made the biggest mistake of his life, and someday, when he realizes what he's lost, it'll be too late." I walked down those church steps with as much dignity as I could muster, my head held high despite the sheer tears streaming down my face. Behind me, I could hear the confused murmur of guests, the awkward conversations about what to do next, the whispered phone calls to cancel the reception. But I didn't look back. I couldn't. Because if I looked back, I might have collapsed right there on the church steps, and I'd already given James enough of my dignity for one lifetime. The drive home was a blur of tears and rage. I kept thinking about the Harvard acceptance letter, the one I'd folded carefully and put away in a drawer, thinking I'd never need it. I thought about the dreams I'd had of becoming a lawyer, of making something of myself, of being more than just someone's wife. Those dreams felt so far away now, like they belonged to a different person entirely. The girl who had gotten into Harvard Law seemed like a stranger, someone naive enough to believe that love was worth any sacrifice. When I finally made it to our apartment, my apartment now, I supposed, I stood in the doorway and surveyed the wreckage of my life. Wedding gifts were stacked in the corner, still wrapped and waiting for a marriage that would never happen. Our suitcases for the honeymoon sat by the door, packed and ready for a trip to Italy that I'd now be taking alone, if at all. I picked up the phone to call to the hotel, to cancel our reservations, to start the process of untangling a life that had been so perfectly planned and was now completely destroyed. But as I dialed, something hardened inside me, something cold and determined and utterly foreign to the girl I'd been that morning. James thought he could humiliate me and walk away without consequences. He thought he could waste 5 years of my life and disappear to Chicago like nothing had happened. He thought wrong. I might have been broken that day, standing in my wedding dress with mascara streaming down my face, but I wasn't finished, not by a long shot. Some mistakes echo through eternity, and James Carson was about to learn that lesson the hard way. 6 months. 6 months of drowning in the wreckage of my destroyed life, of watching James move on like our 5 years together meant nothing. He'd gotten a promotion at Morrison and Associates, the law firm where he worked as a junior associate. Apparently, his boss, Richard Morrison, had been impressed with his renewed focus after ending our relationship. Renewed focus. That's what they called it when you destroy someone's life and then profit from their absence. I'd been surviving on freelance graphic design work, barely making rent on our apartment that felt like a mausoleum of broken dreams. Every morning I woke up on the couch because I couldn't bear to sleep in the bed we'd shared. Every night I stared at that Harvard rejection letter I'd finally thrown away, wondering what kind of person I might have been if I'd chosen differently. The rain was coming down in sheets that Tuesday night when I finally decided to drive to the grocery store. I'd been putting it off for days, living on crackers and whatever I could find in the back of my cupboards, but the loneliness was eating me alive, and I thought maybe being around other people, even strangers in a supermarket, might make me feel less like a ghost haunting my own life. I should have stayed home. The truck came out of nowhere, running the red light at full speed. I saw the headlights in my peripheral vision for maybe half a second before impact. The sound of metal crushing metal, of glass exploding, of my own scream cut short. Then silence. I remember floating above my car, watching paramedics work frantically on a body that looked like me but felt like someone else entirely. There was so much blood, so much twisted metal. I remember thinking how ironic it was that James had finally gotten what he wanted, a world where I didn't exist. The last thing I saw before everything went black was Richard Morrison himself at the hospital, talking to the doctors. He was there because I'd listed the law firm as my emergency contact, back when I thought I might become part of their family through marriage. He looked genuinely upset. This powerful man I'd only met twice, standing there in his expensive suit while they explained that Emily Chen had died from her injuries. Emily Chen, past tense. Was that really how my story ended? But death, it turns out, is more negotiable than most people think. I opened my eyes to sunlight streaming through familiar windows, to the smell of my mother's jasmine tea brewing downstairs, to the sound of my own 17-year-old voice saying, "Oh my God," in a pitch I hadn't heard in over a decade. The Harvard acceptance letter was in my hands, crisp and unfolded, dated exactly 10 years earlier. My dorm room was exactly as I'd left it, with posters of bands I'd forgotten I loved and textbooks scattered across a desk I'd studied at night after night. But I wasn't 17 anymore. Not really. I was Emily Chen, aged 27, with 10 years of memories and a lifetime of rage burning inside a teenager's body. My phone buzzed with a text from James. "Can't wait to see you tonight. I have something important to ask you." Something important to ask me. I knew what that was. He was going to ask me to stay, to choose him over Harvard, to build a life together that would end with me in a wedding dress and him nowhere to be found. But not this time. This time I had something he'd never seen coming, the knowledge of exactly who he really was. I typed back, "Sorry, I can't tonight. I have some important decisions to make about my future." Then I called Harvard and confirmed my acceptance. The next 10 years were a blur of calculated moves and strategic positioning. Harvard Law was everything I'd imagined and more. I graduated summa cum laude, passed the bar with flying colours, and got recruited by the most prestigious firms in Boston. But I had my eye on a different prize. Morrison and Associates had expanded, becoming Morrison, Blake and Associates. Richard Morrison, now in his 50s, had built an empire. More importantly, he'd built an empire that James Carson was still desperately trying to climb. Oh yes, I'd kept tabs on my former fiancé. He'd gotten his law degree eventually, from a much less prestigious school, and had been working his way up at Morrison's firm with all the enthusiasm of a man who thought he deserved more than he'd earned. James had no idea that the brilliant corporate lawyer who'd been making waves in Boston legal circles was his former girlfriend. Why would he? Emily Chen had died in a car accident 10 years ago, according to all the public records. The woman who walked into Morrison, Blake and Associates as their new senior partner was someone else entirely. Or so I let them believe. Richard Morrison was exactly as I remembered him. Commanding, intelligent, with silver hair and the kind of presence that made rooms go quiet when he entered. What I hadn't expected was how drawn he'd be to someone who could match his intellect and ambition. What I hadn't counted on was falling for him. Just a little, despite everything. "You're extraordinary," he told me after I'd won my third major case in 2 months. We were working late in his office, the city lights twinkling below us like fallen stars. "I've never met anyone who thinks like you do." If only he knew. "I've had good motivation," I said, allowing myself a small smile. "Sometimes the best revenge is simply becoming the person who can't be ignored." He laughed, thinking I was speaking in generalities. "Revenge? That's a strong word for career advancement." "Is it?" I met his eyes, letting just a hint of the fire inside me show through. "I think revenge is just another word for justice, delayed but not denied." That night, he kissed me in his office, and I let him, because it felt good to be wanted by someone who could appreciate the woman I'd become, rather than the girl I'd once been. But even as I kissed him back, I was thinking about James, about the look on his face when he realised who I was and what I'd become. 3 months later, Richard proposed. The ring was everything I'd dreamed of when I was young and naive, a perfect diamond that caught the light like captured lightning. But this time, I wasn't a girl giving up her dreams for love. I was a woman, using love as a weapon. Yes, I said, slipping the ring onto my finger. I'll marry you. What I didn't tell him was that I'd already chosen the venue. The same church where James had left me crying at the altar. The same oak doors where I'd learned what humiliation tasted like. The same place where, in just 3 weeks, James would watch me walk down the aisle with his boss, the man who controlled his career, his future, his entire professional life. But here's what makes this story really delicious. The morning after I accepted Richard's proposal, I did something that would have made my 17-year-old self proud. I walked into James's office. Yes, he still worked there. Still a junior associate after all these years. Still struggling to prove himself worthy of the Morrison name. He looked up from his desk, and for a moment I saw a flicker of recognition in his eyes. Just a flicker. Like his brain was trying to process something impossible. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice uncertain. "Actually," I said, smiling the kind of smile that could cut glass, "I think I can help you. I'm Emily Blake. I'll be your new senior partner." His face went white. "Emily Blake. That's right. I kept my professional name when I got engaged to Richard. Speaking of which, you'll be receiving a wedding invitation soon. I do hope you'll come. After all, it's going to be quite the event." I watched the colour drain from his face as the implications hit him. His former girlfriend, supposedly dead, was now not only alive but engaged to his boss. The woman he'd abandoned at the altar now controlled his professional future. "Emily," he whispered, and I could hear the 17 years of guilt and regret in that single word. "You're supposed to be dead." I finished for him, my smile never wavering. "Yes, I heard about that. Car accident, wasn't it? Very sad. But, as you can see, reports of my death were greatly exaggerated. The truth was more complicated than that. But James didn't need to know about the impossible things, about the bargains made with forces beyond human understanding, about the price I'd paid to come back and finish what he'd started. All he needed to know was that his reckoning had finally arrived. The invitation was perfect. Cream-coloured cardstock with gold embossing, the kind of elegant stationery that screamed old money and power, but it was the words that really mattered. "Mr. Richard Morrison and Miss Emily Blake request the pleasure of your company at their wedding ceremony on Saturday, the 15th of June, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, at St. Margaret's Church." The same church. The exact same church where James had left me crying at the altar 10 years ago. I'd made sure of that. I hand-delivered James's invitation myself, walking into his cramped office with a smile that could have powered the entire building. He looked like he'd aged 15 years in the 3 weeks since I'd revealed who I was. The bags under his eyes suggested he wasn't sleeping, and the way his hand shook slightly when he reached for his coffee told me he was finally understanding the magnitude of his situation. "Your invitation," I said sweetly, placing the envelope on his desk. "I do hope you'll be able to attend. Richard specifically asked me to make sure all the junior associates felt included." Junior associates. After 12 years at the firm, James was still a junior associate, still scrambling for scraps while other people his age had made partner at competing firms. I'd made sure of that too, subtly undermining his cases, redirecting important clients away from him, ensuring that every opportunity for advancement seemed to slip through his fingers at the last moment. "Emily," he said, and his voice cracked like a teenager's, "we need to talk." "Do we?" I tilted my head, feigning confusion. "I can't imagine what we'd have to discuss. Unless you're having trouble with the Pemberton contract? I noticed some irregularities in your research." His face went pale. The Pemberton contract was his biggest case, the one he'd been banking on to finally prove himself worthy of promotion. The irregularities I'd mentioned were minor, easily fixable, but in a firm like Morrison's, even small mistakes could be career-ending. "Those weren't irregularities," he said quickly. "Those were oversights? I suggested helpfully. Don't worry, I've already corrected them. After all, we can't have the Morrison name associated with sloppy work, can we? The way his jaw clenched told me he understood exactly what I was doing. I was saving his case while simultaneously making it clear that his career now depended entirely on my goodwill. Every success he had would be because I allowed it. Every failure would be because I orchestrated it. "Why are you doing this?" he whispered. I leaned against his desk, close enough that he could smell my perfume. The same one I'd worn to our almost wedding, though he probably didn't remember. "I'm not doing anything, James. I'm simply excelling at my job. Isn't that what you always said you wanted? For me to be successful?" Of course, he'd never said that. What he'd actually said was that my ambitions were cute but unrealistic, that I should focus on building a home instead of chasing impossible dreams. He'd convinced me that love was more important than career, that being his wife was a higher calling than being a lawyer. How wrong he'd been. The next few weeks were exquisite torture. I watched James struggle with whether to attend the wedding, knowing that his absence would be noticed by Richard and could cost him his job, but his presence would be admitting defeat in the most public way possible. I made sure to schedule several meetings with him, always finding reasons to mention wedding details. "The flowers will be white roses," I mentioned during one particularly satisfying encounter. "I know they're traditional, but I've always been fond of them. They remind me of new beginnings." James's face had gone grey at that because he remembered. White roses had been my choice for our wedding bouquet, the one I clutched so tightly that the thorns drew blood while I waited for him to show up. But the real masterpiece was yet to come. 2 days before the wedding, I made my final move. I scheduled a company-wide meeting, supposedly to discuss the quarterly results, but really to deliver the news that would destroy what was left of James's composure. "I'm pleased to announce," I said, standing at the head of the conference table in the main boardroom, "that Morrison, Blake and Associates will be expanding our family law division. We'll be taking on more divorce cases, particularly those involving abandonment and emotional cruelty." I let my eyes find James across the room, watched the colour drain from his face as he realised what I was implying. Everyone else just heard a business announcement. He heard a threat. "Of course," I continued, "we'll need lawyers who understand the pain of betrayal, who can truly empathise with clients who've been left devastated by the people they trusted most. It takes a special kind of person to fight for justice when the legal system seems stacked against the innocent." Richard squeezed my hand under the table, thinking I was being inspirational. He had no idea I was delivering a very personal message to the man who taught me what betrayal felt like. The morning of the wedding, I woke up in Richard's penthouse apartment feeling like a queen preparing for battle. My dress was red, not white, never white again. White was for innocent girls who believed in happy endings. Red was for women who made their own justice. The hair and makeup team I'd hired transformed me into something that belonged on magazine covers. My dress hugged every curve, made my skin glow like porcelain, turned me into the kind of woman men started wars over. But the real transformation was in my eyes. The scared, heartbroken girl who'd once stood at those church doors was gone, replaced by someone who understood that power was the only currency that mattered. "You look incredible," Richard said, kissing my cheek carefully so as not to disturb my lipstick. "I can't believe I'm about to marry the most beautiful, brilliant woman in Boston." If only he knew what kind of woman he was really marrying. The limousine ride to the church was surreal. The same route I'd taken 10 years ago, but this time I wasn't a nervous bride worried about being late. I was a predator, arriving at the exact right moment to spring my trap. When we pulled up to St. Margaret's, I could see the crowd of guests already assembled. The same church, many of the same people, but this time they were here to witness my triumph instead of my humiliation. This time I was the one in control. But the real show hadn't started yet. As Richard and I walked up those same stone steps where I'd once scattered blood-stained roses, I caught sight of James standing near the back of the church. He looked like a man attending his own execution, his face grey and hollow, his hand shaking as he clutched his programme. Next to him stood a young woman in a pretty blue dress, and my breath caught when I saw her face. She was maybe 23, with dark hair and gentle eyes, and she looked at James with the same adoring expression I'd once worn. The same trust, the same faith, the same dangerous belief that love could conquer anything. Poor little lamb. She had no idea what kind of man she'd given her heart to, but she was about to learn. I squeezed Richard's arm and smiled up at him. Ready to make me the happiest woman alive? He beamed down at me, completely unaware that my happiness had nothing to do with marrying him, and everything to do with the exquisite revenge that was about to unfold. As we walked down that aisle together, every eye in the church turned to watch us, but the only eyes I cared about belonged to James, and the look of absolute horror on his face was better than any wedding gift I could have received. This time, I wasn't the one who would be crying at the altar. This time, I was the one holding all the power. The I do had barely left my lips when I felt it, that familiar hunger stirring in my chest, the one that had been growing stronger since the moment I'd opened my eyes in my 17-year-old body. Richard kissed me with such passion, such genuine love, that for a split second I almost felt guilty about what I really was. But guilt was a luxury I'd abandoned in my grave. As we walked back down the aisle, husband and wife, I caught James's eye one final time. He looked like a man who'd seen his own death, which was fitting because, in a way, he had. But it was the young woman beside him, Hannah, sweet, naive Hannah, who made my dead heart skip with anticipation. She was clapping enthusiastically, tears of joy streaming down her face as she watched what she thought was a beautiful love story. If only she knew she was witnessing the beginning of her own nightmare. The reception hall gleamed with crystal and candlelight, everything perfect, everything designed to showcase the Morrison family's wealth and influence. Richard's colleagues and clients mingled with Boston's elite, all of them eager to curry favour with the new Mrs. Morrison. I played my part beautifully. The radiant bride, the accomplished lawyer, the perfect addition to the Morrison empire. But I was hunting. I watched Hannah whisper excitedly to James about how romantic everything was, how she hoped their wedding would be half as beautiful. Poor darling had no idea that James had already had his chance at a church wedding, and he'd chosen to run instead of face the altar. "She's so beautiful," Hannah gushed to one of James's colleagues, nodding towards me. "And so accomplished. A Harvard lawyer who landed Richard Morrison. She must be incredible." "Oh, she is," said Patricia Morrison, James's mother, who'd apparently forgotten her role in my previous humiliation. "Richard's absolutely smitten, though there's something about her that seems so familiar." I drifted closer to their conversation, champagne flute in hand, smiling like the perfect hostess. "Mrs. Morrison," Hannah said warmly when she saw me approaching, "congratulations! Your wedding was absolutely magical." "Thank you," I replied, studying her face intently. She really was lovely, all soft curves and genuine smiles. The kind of woman men wanted to protect. The kind of woman I'd once been. "And you are?" "Hannah Pierce. I'm James's girlfriend." She blushed prettily when she said it, like being attached to James Carson was some sort of accomplishment. "How wonderful," I said, letting my smile sharpen just slightly. "And how long have you two been together?" 8 months, she beamed. "He's incredible, so ambitious, so driven. He's working on this huge case that could make his career the Pemberton case, the one I'd been systematically sabotaging for weeks." "James Carson, you said?" I pretended to think. "The name sounds familiar. Richard, darling," I called to my husband, who was deep in conversation with a federal judge. "Isn't James Carson one of your junior associates?" Richard looked over, and I watched James's face go ashen as my husband's attention focused on him. "Oh, yes, Carson," Richard said, joining our little group. "Hard-working fellow, though he's been struggling lately. Some issues with attention to detail, missed deadlines. We've been discussing whether he's really Morrison material." Hannah's smile faltered. I'm sure there's been some misunderstanding." "Oh, I am sure there has been," I said sweetly. "Men can be so unpredictable when they're under pressure. Can't they, James?" James looked like he was going to be sick. He knew exactly what I was doing, and he was powerless to stop it. Actually, I continued, I'd love to hear about this big case Hannah mentioned. James, was it? Perhaps you could tell us about it? It's confidential, James stammered. Of course it is, Richard said with a frown. Though, Carson, I should mention there were some significant errors in your recent filings. Emily caught them during her review. Without her intervention, we could have faced serious sanctions. I watched Hannah's face as the implications sank in. Her boyfriend's career was hanging by a thread, and the beautiful bride in red was the only thing standing between James and professional ruin. How fortunate that your wife is so thorough, Hannah said quietly, a new wariness creeping into her voice. Oh, I'm very thorough, I agreed. I never forget a face, never overlook a detail. Some might say I have an almost supernatural memory for people who've wronged me. James made a strangled sound, and Hannah looked between us with growing confusion. James, are you all right? She asked. You look like you've seen a ghost. A ghost, I repeated thoughtfully. What an interesting choice of words. That's when Richard was called away by another guest, leaving me alone with James and his unsuspecting girlfriend. The moment I'd been building toward all evening. Hannah? I said, my voice dropping to something softer, more intimate. May I give you some advice? Woman to woman? She nodded eagerly, probably thinking she was about to receive wisdom from a successful female role model. Be very careful who you trust with your heart, I said, letting my eyes drift meaningfully to James. Some men will make you promises they have no intention of keeping. They'll let you build your whole life around them, then disappear when things get real. I don't understand, Hannah said, but I could see the seeds of doubt taking root. 10 years ago, I continued, there was a young woman who thought she'd found her forever love. She gave up Harvard Law School for him, planning their perfect life together. But when their wedding day came, he wasn't there. He just vanished, left her standing at the altar in front of everyone she knew. Hannah's face had gone white. That's horrible. What kind of monster would do something like that? The kind, I said, staring directly at James, who convinces you that love means sacrifice, then punishes you for believing him? James was shaking now, actually trembling as he realized what I was doing. Emily, he whispered, please. Hannah's head snapped towards him. You know her. How do you know her? He knows me very well, I answered for him. Don't you, James? After all, we were engaged for over a year. We planned our whole future together, until he decided he wasn't ready for marriage, and sent his best man to tell me, while I stood in my wedding dress. The champagne flute slipped from Hannah's fingers, shattering on the marble floor. That's not... James, tell me that's not true. But James's couldn't speak. He was staring at me with absolute terror, finally understanding that this wasn't just about revenge. This was about justice. This was about making sure he never destroyed another innocent woman the way he'd destroyed me. The bride in that story, I continued relentlessly, died 6 months later. Car accident. Very tragic. She never got to see what her life might have been if she'd chosen differently. Hannah was backing away from James now, pieces clicking into place. You're her. You're the woman he left at the altar. In a manner of speaking, I said, though I prefer to think of myself as what she became. But you're married to Mr. Morrison now, Hannah said desperately, trying to make sense of what she was hearing. You moved on. You found happiness. Did I? I tilted my head and, for just a moment, let her see something of what was really behind my eyes. Something cold and hungry and definitely not human. Or did I simply find a more permanent solution to the problem James created? Hannah screamed. Not a little gasp or cry of surprise, a full-throated scream of absolute terror as she finally saw what I really was, what James's betrayal had awakened, what had crawled out of a grave wearing Emily Chen's face but carrying something much darker inside. The reception hall went silent, every head turned toward us. Richard came running, his face full of concern for his new bride. What's wrong? He demanded. What? happened? She's not human, Hannah sobbed, pointing at me with a shaking finger. She's not human, and she's going to kill us all. The guests began to murmur uneasily. Some laughed, thinking this was some sort of dramatic outburst. Others looked uncertain, sensing something wrong, but not understanding what. Hannah, you're hysterical, James said desperately. You're not making sense. Ask him, Hannah screamed, whirling toward Richard. Ask your wife about James Carson. Ask her about the wedding 10 years ago. Ask her why she knows so much about abandoned brides. Richard looked at me, confusion and concern warring in his eyes. Emily, what is she talking about? I smiled at my husband, the man who'd loved me without knowing what I truly was, and felt something almost like regret. She's talking about unfinished business, I said softly, about debts that carry over from one lifetime to the next, about what happens when someone breaks something that was never meant to be broken. The lights began to flicker. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees in an instant, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled despite the clear evening sky. You see, darling, I said to Richard, reaching up to touch his face one last time, some love stories don't have happy endings. Some have other kinds of endings entirely. The last thing anyone in that church would remember was my laughter, echoing through the halls like church bells tolling for the dead.